Okay, in part two of my video series on popular falsehoods in the Black community, for this second video, I want to talk about the delusions and obsessions centered around Islam, Nigeria, and the Navajo Nation. Okay? Now, of course, yes, I am descended from two indigenous tribes on my mother's side and two indigenous tribes on my father's side as well. And DNA testing on me and also on some of my dad's relatives has confirmed that what we already knew, like who we come from, that 100% of our non-white ancestors were not all from Africa. Some of them were from here. And, but with that said, what I've noticed in the American Black community and in the Black Indian community, and also in a lot of reservation Indian social spaces that I've seen in the past, there seems to be this love and obsession with Islam, Nigeria, and the sellout Indian tribes that sold a lot of their fellow indigenous people from other tribes into slavery. And the problem I have with it is this, okay? For one thing, these are groups of people who sold your Native American ancestors into slavery and became some of the biggest indigenous landholders in the entire country. I don't think anybody has more land than Navajos. And they're not, and same thing with Nigerians. A lot of Nigerians enjoy a level of privilege that regular American Blacks often, they just don't have access to. And these people, they sold their neighboring tribes. They made enormous amounts of money, but they also cursed your bloodlines. And long before white colonization began, Arabs did the same thing too, where selling part of your family tree into slavery and also cursing the bloodline. Like these, with the Navajos, Nigerians, and Arabs, they do a lot of witchcraft, and they don't solely just sell you into slavery after they defeat you. They also curse your bloodline. And what's frustrating to me is I've often told my mother, who may or may not be willing to accept it, but I've often told my mother, I'm like, hey, too many of our people are in love with and idealizing the culture and religions of these other tribes of their own race who sold their family and cursed their bloodline. I'm like, how can you say that you're too whitewashed and you're not Black enough or you're not Indian enough if you're not embracing the ways of a group of people that defeated your ancestors, sold them, and cursed their bloodline too? That's just ridiculous. And on top of that, now in modern times, Arabs are still capturing Africans and selling them into brutal slavery that is cruel and involves a lot of human rights violations. And we always see all these different Arabs on TV asking people to feel sorry for them, asking people to stop being prejudiced against them, always talking about how Europe destabilized their territories and did so much cruel stuff. But look at the shit they're still doing. They're still capturing Africans and selling them into brutal, cruel, inhumane chattel slavery, which traditionally did include cutting the penis and the balls off of the male slaves. So with that said, I have a big problem with the fact that not enough people in the Black community are aware of this, that yes, whites may have enslaved Black people and Native Americans as well together for a couple hundred years, but you had Arabs who were already doing the same thing in Africa for much, much longer than that. I heard one licensed psychiatrist who has a big following in the Black community. I heard her say that the Arab slave trade goes back at least 1,200 years in Africa and started long before white people were doing it. And that doesn't even breach the issue of Nigerians who also still practice chattel slavery today. And some of them work their slaves to death. Some of them have slaves who drown to death. And it's like when you hear Black people or Native Americans talk about slavery, you'll hear them saying the types of things that you'll hear white rednecks saying. They'll be saying, oh, well, when colored people practice slavery, it's nowhere near as cruel and as sick as how white people did it. And I'm like, and I know God, that's a goddamn lie. It's cruel and sick in the way colored people do slavery now in modern times, and it was cruel and sick in ancient times. The only difference is that colored people did not write it down and did not document it as extensively as whites did. Just because you didn't write it down and didn't document it as extensively, that don't mean the shit didn't happen. That don't mean you can sit there and lie to your people saying, oh, well, our slaves was just like one of the family and they won't treat it no different and they's happy and one of us. And that's a goddamn lie. A goddamn bald-faced lie. Now, I know that there is still a lot of lawlessness and jungle law and tribalism in mainstream white society that tries to present itself as a democratic republic when a lot of times, in many cases, it's just not. You know, it just all depends on what kind of mood they in or whether or not they know you personally, whether or not they're going to enact a real, actual democratic republic and rule by laws, or if they're just going to do shit according to how they feel and invent policies. You know, whichever way they swing, it depends on what mood they're in and whether or not they know you personally. This is something that a lot of people have been burned by in mainstream white society. However, we cannot forget that there are a lot of problems among our own people that did not start with white colonization. Arabs were already brainwashing Black men, cutting their penis off and breeding with all of the women for hundreds, if not thousands of years, long before white people started doing it, and they're still doing it today. And these Nigerians who have so many Black American, Caribbean, Hispanic, and white converts to their religions, these people, they not only cursed the bloodlines of the people they sold, but they have some of the highest rates of domestic violence in all of Nigeria. Their women don't have a voice in mainstream society. When they're women, a lot of times, their women have very little or no voice in mainstream society when they're talking about things that really need to change. And I'm sorry to say it, but culture and poor selective breeding practices, that has fed a lot into a lot of the toxic cycles that have fed into the continuous decline of most societies of people of color for the last 11,600 years. The culture and the selective breeding practices, that's underlying a lot of the issues that we have going on right now that was already a big deal long before white people ever showed up. The whole thing with, you know, the snow bunny worship and ignoring the fact that your own people are vastly outnumbered and making white women the queens of your life and spreading the lie that you birth more girls than boys to hide the fact that you're to hide the greater problems and to not look guilty for not dealing with it. You know, so all the lies to cover up the real issues, trying to make it seem like there's so many women and you can't get around all of them. And no, there's some other shit going on. And this idealization of people who ruined their lands, ruined their ecosystems, and ruined their countries, and then want to turn around and come be the dominant culture in your territory after they done cursed your bloodline and aided and abetted people who dominate you. How are you going to idealize some of the same groups of people who betrayed you and cursed your ancestors? And I'm sorry to say it, but at no point in human history has any group of Black people of Hebrew descent gone throughout the whole earth selling other ethnic groups of Black people into slavery to other races. It has not happened. At no point in human history has Black people of Hebrew descent gone about just trying to colonize the whole planet and take over a whole lot of other people's homes. It has just never been done. But yet then you have these Arabs where they do not have lower rates of pedophilia. They do not have lower rates of rape. Even in places like the United Kingdom, in England, it's like more than half the Pakistani Muslims there are married to a first cousin. If women are so plentiful and so numerous, why is more than half of them married to a first cousin in England? They're in a foreign country where they have access to plenty of other races of women. So if they have such an overabundance of women, why over half of them got to be married to a first cousin? I mean, there's something's clearly and obviously not right with what they're doing, where they, no matter where you put people who have that type of lifestyle, their rates of pedophilia, their rates of rape, abuse, and murder of women is pretty much the same, if not higher. And the only difference is that they just have higher rates of incest and inbreeding. That's it. They don't have lower rates of anything else. Why should we continue to give birth to that? We should not be continuing to give birth to that. And I personally made a choice not to give birth to that myself. And I have 3 little boys, and the fathers of my children, no, they're not perfect. They don't have a master's degree in engineering like my biological dad. They're not Air Force veterans and built like G.I. Joe like my biological father. Okay, the fathers of my children, they're not on the same level as my biological dad, who is a Black man. But what I can say about the biological fathers of my children is that even though they're not on the same level as my Black father and my Black mother, who are both dark-skinned and of Indigenous American descent, I can at least say that the fathers of my children were college educated, and I can say that at least they had enough discipline and self-control and intellect to at least have some degree of college education, even though they didn't finish. And, and the father of my firstborn son, he actually threatened to stab me in the head with a knife and accused me of witchcraft because his sex drive just naturally became lower while I was pregnant. And he was with my first child at 30 years old, and he was coming home every night. I even pulled up an article written by medical doctors which says that when a man is actually taking care of a pregnant woman and coming home to her every night, the hormones in her sweat hits the vomeronasal organ in his sinus cavity, and the hormone sends a signal that lowers his sex drive to prepare him to become a parent. And even though I showed him scientific articles explaining how that works, he still stood over me with a huge kitchen knife over my head, threatening to stab me in the head and claiming that I used witchcraft to use his sex drive, and I didn't. His body just naturally responded to the pregnancy hormones in my sweat, and I almost died for that. So when Black YouTube influencers talk about how Black men tend to murder women of their own race at rates 4 times higher than men of other races do it to their own women, I can relate to that, because there were a few times in situations exactly like what I just explained where I could have died myself. And when you have toxic people from Islam and from Nigeria and from the Western nations, Western tribes that sold other tribes into slavery and became the dominant culture in Indian country, when you have these types of people indoctrinating the men, I do know with confidence that this does directly contribute to a lot of violence against women and a lot of ignorance against women. The ignorance and the violence against women, it goes so deep. And although white America can be very lawless and tribalistic and making decisions based on feelings, and whether or not they're going to intervene when you have a problem, but depends on how they feel about it and if they know you, even though they tend to be like that and the whole planet knows it. They say, oh, this is not who we are, but that is who they are. Everybody knows it. But at the end of the day, America is still a work in progress. It's still a work in progress. And supporting the same tribes, the same Native American tribes, the same Nigerian tribes, the same Arabs who sold your Native American ancestors and cursed them, who sold your African ancestors and cursed them, cursing your entire bloodline. I hope to see a day where you'll let go of their culture, let go of their selective breeding practices, and I hope that someday mainstream American society will embrace practices more similar to what you would see in like the original Muskogee Creek and Iroquois Confederacy culture before they started intermarrying and becoming slave masters themselves. In the culture that I grew up in, the same culture that most of my relatives and also the reservation Indians abandoned, both, the children get their plates first, then men, and then the highest ranking man, he eats last. And this is a simple practice that's supposed to remind everyone every day of where they stand in the community. This is a daily practice of humility. And in the very evil cultures that I just talked about, that is not done. And what I'm hoping is that people will be more open to the original form of indigenous culture that reinforces daily humility that a lot of Black indigenous families and also reservation families, they don't do anymore. I'm hoping to see a return to the practice of daily humility through things like even how we share our meals together. And that's if we have family around to share a meal with. I'm hoping that someday the obsession with the toxic cultures that's been destroying our people and feeding regressionism and environmental destruction, I'm hoping the obsession with adopting the ways of those enemy tribes will subside, because at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is, yes, you may have had a few white Jews far removed from Israel who participated in the fuckery with everybody else. But the fact of the matter remains is that Black Hebrew people have never done shit on the level of what Arabs and Nigerians and Navajos did. They didn't. And in the book of Deuteronomy, it spells it out clearly that if you have a neighboring tribe that has high rates of incest, then this automatically makes you a whole lot more likely to get approval from the Most High God, where you can wage war on them. And it's clearly spells out, I think it's in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 20, that you offer the enemy faction a compromise a specific number of times, and if they say no to the compromise a specific number of times, and if the Most High God gives you consent to wage war after their refusal to compromise a specific number of times, then game on, anything goes. Well, not almost anything, but yeah, then it says, okay, under that circumstances, then war can occur. There's clearly defined practices for what is and isn't allowed. And in the Bible, where you have Hebrews killing all the men and killing all the adult women and only leaving little girls under the age of 10 alive, just like what the pagan men of the ancient world were doing. You'll notice the Hebrews had very, very little, or in most cases, no prophecy when they were doing those types of things. And if you look in the book of Samuel, the Hebrew God is basically saying, look, you've rejected me consistently, like almost the entire time that I've known you. And now you're saying that you don't want me to rule over you. You want a king. You want a mortal man to rule over you and not me. So here's, and the Hebrew God says, here's what I'll do for you. I'll give you a king. I'll give you a mortal man to rule over you since you don't want me. But when you cry out to me because he's taking your children away from you, I will ignore you and I will not answer.